Welcome to the Intercut Film Club here on the Intercut podcast channel, where we take a look at a movie that people can't cut away from. I am your co-host, Zachary Shevich, and joining me, he just wants you to listen to his tape. It's Arturo Zurita.
I don't have a New York one, but I'm sure by the next time when we do that one, I'll have one ready.
Yeah, speaking of New York, these are a couple of Scorsese's New York set movies. Not that that is a rarity for him. A lot of his films are set in the city, but these films that we're looking at today, in particular, are a very street-level look at a Scorsese, as a New York that I think Scorsese is very familiar with. The Scorsese who was once running around in the midst of his cocaine addiction, going from club to club. I think you see a lot of that Scorsese in both these movies. And it's just an interesting pair of movies to look at because in the breadth of his filmography, obviously he's had a lot of films that have been treated as masterpieces. But this is sort of like an in-between period where he maybe wasn't quite, people didn't quite respond the way they do to some of his earlier films. Obviously, you know, he starts out with some films like Mean Streets, Italian American, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, eventually getting to Taxi Driver, what a lot of people think is the first masterpiece in his catalog. Film gets nominated for a couple Oscars and really puts him on the map. Eventually, he gets to Raging Bull, which he directs in 1980, and that film is instantly hailed as a modern masterpiece. It's the film that wins Robert De Niro an acting Oscar, wins his editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, an Oscar as well. But Scorsese goes home empty-handed, despite getting the Oscar nomination. And if you read his recent GQ profile, he also talks about this moment being a moment when he felt that he and the Oscars just didn't see eye to eye, that he was not going to concern himself that much with what they thought after that. And it then becomes an interesting period of searching for Scorsese in the 80s, where he's sort of trying to find his next project. The first one that we get after Raging Bull is The King of Comedy. It's a movie that whose script he was brought earlier and he didn't respond to it, although at this point in his career he's starting to reckon with his newfound fame and he finds a reason to connect to the project. And then eventually he tries to get The Last Temptation of Christ made, but when the funding is pulled by Paramount weeks before production, he pivots to After Hours in 1985 and makes a film that he felt like he could just put a lot of his own personal style into. So Art, we're talking about a couple of the overlooked Scorsese movies here. You know, they didn't get the Oscars love that a lot of his other films did. They maybe got some critical love, but they're certainly not remembered in the same breath as films like Raging Bull or his later film Goodfellas would be. But getting a chance to revisit these movies, what did you make of them, either individually or as a pair?
They're also known as cult films, you know. It's like if these are the lowest ones in your filmography,
right.
That's great. I'd seen King of Comedy a couple of years back, and I was when everyone was making the Joker comparisons, but I got to see After Hours for the first time. So
Same.
While I was doing my double feature, I'm like, you know, he like really captures New York in these in almost like a time capsule way, and even almost like inverse to each other, because in the King of Comedy, there's a lot of shots where he's out there in Times Square where he's running down the streets of New York in the daylight. And then After Hours is like those same streets, but like at night in the grungiest way possible. And I'm watching these, I'm like, dang. Oh, wait, that's right. Our category here is that they're New York movies, and it really stands out for these. They're both fantastic. I look forward to catching these multiple times, like, well after this.
Right.
Because I feel like I've only scratched the surface having watched these in the midst of a festival for the video. And there's like so much more. I can see rewatches of these having my rating go higher for them. Starting off with King of Comedy, I think everything that they said for Joker is still there,
Yeah.
even more so than before. But I love the fact that for Joker 2, when they're saying what's going to be the next one, and they're saying it's going to be New York, New York, the fact that you already have the stand-in of Liza Minnelli in the background for this movie, because I guess she had filmed a scene, but it never made it. It's like you're just seeing the pieces of what this man, what's his name?
Todd Phillips.
Joker. Yeah, he's just like tit for tat copying it. It's like
Yeah.
when Tarantino goes overseas to take some stuff that we haven't seen to make an American version. This man's not even. He's just going back in time
Yeah.
from our
When
own
I-
movies here.
When I saw Joker, I had seen King of Comedy like a few years back, so I knew the echoes of it. This is the first time that I'd watched King of Comedy since I saw Joker.
Joker?
And
Interesting.
The inspiration is so direct. It's
Honestly.
such a it's more than just like copying the idea of certain scenes, but it's like the whole undertone of like this is sort of like frightening, even if it is a little bit charming. It's on the line of funny but upsetting. It's so
Yeah.
like he's copying that whole atmosphere completely.
It's like the closest that we have nowadays would have been Ingrid Goes West from a couple of years ago, where you have that more modern take of a person who really wants to be famous and thinks they deserve it. But honestly, this does deserve the extra half star that I did not give it on the rewatch, because the take on this is insane, where you have a comedian who believes that he should be given this like 5 seconds of limelight, but the way that it's directed is honestly psychotic. Like,
Yeah.
like I already knew what the gist was, but even on the rewatch where it begins, where this man comes up to the late night host played by Jerry Lewis, and he's asking for just a chance, right? And he gets ignored. And then the next thing they're sitting down for dinner, I'm like, oh, I guess he got no. It's like the way that it is told is so much through his perspective.
Yeah.
That Joker, it almost answers things for Joker that people had theories on. And so, like,
Yeah.
go look at the source material, and whatever that answered, it's there. And then even
Right.
vice versa. In the rewatch, I already know how it ends, but I'm like, is this the one where it ends more violently, or is that the take on the Joker? And then the more I was reading into it, this one almost had a violent ending that ended up kind of being used for the Joker. So it's just fascinating to see how both of these come into play, specifically because Scorsese
Yeah.
ended up becoming producer for Joker. But damn, bro, this one stands the test of time, and it's crazy to think that it got bashed a lot. Even
Yeah.
recently, you know, he's been making those appearances with his daughter.
TikToks.
Which his
With
daughter even
Francesca,
appears
yeah.
in this movie. His older daughter appears as a fan during a dinner scene, but with his younger daughter, he was just talking about how this was the one that was panned. And I love how he quoted exactly who said it was a
The
flop.
flop of the year, yeah.
Look, I think it stood the test of time, and if anything, especially with today's age, this like really resonates.
Yeah, I wonder if audiences just weren't necessarily ready for
Ready?
this in 1983, or at least like aware of the kind of like perverted ambition, the perverted like obsession with fame and that kind of like ambitious energy.
It got the Joker
feels like a
treatment.
more it feels like a more modern refrain we're seeing in movies nowadays. I mean, I feel like the whole idea of this like person who is doing these awful things that ultimately gets held up as kind of like an interesting, noteworthy person is this character arc we see over and over again, whether it's stuff that is like Joker and more directly like similar to this, or even a film like Nightcrawler, which has a lot of differences but also weird similarities to its sort of anti-hero arc, right?
Yeah,
And
rooting for them to
any-
do the bad thing.
and then them like ultimately succeeding in a perverse way because of the way the incentive structures that society has put forth. And I think there's a lot of really smart satire going on in this movie. It is also like a deeply funny movie in a way that I don't normally find a lot of Scorsese's films of this era to be funny. Like there
Yeah.
are hilarious jokes and running gags. The whole bit with the last name is so much more like slapsticky and silly than he normally gets. It's also like, particularly for De Niro, I thought a really, really interesting performance. I've never seen him play a loser quite like he does in this movie.
Yeah, I always forget that Cape Fear is also Scorsese's remake that he was also in. I don't know if you've seen that one, but
Yeah.
that's like a very unhinged De Niro, and that's like
Yeah.
the closest I can connect to this. But you're right, he is a loser in this one. He looks cool in Cape Fear, a creep, but you know
And
he's got that like
terrifying in Cape Fear.
he's like Bill. Here it's like I don't know what's going to set you off. And you could tell that that's exactly what Joaquin was looking after. And, reading a lot of the reviews for it, it felt like people were more scared of what the movie was talking about. Like they were judging the movie for like it was implicit in what the character was doing, and it's like it's weird. It's crazy to think that all these years later we're still kind of doing that with how we review media, especially in our last Scorsese wrap up with The Wolf of Wall Street, right?
Street.
That
Yeah.
this has been a reoccurring thing that he's got in his entire career. Now, you began this by telling me what Scorsese was known for during that time, and I was reading up that he got really sick during the making of this movie. Now I understand why he was exhausted. But I think it's fascinating where it leads to, because I believe we're talking spoilers since this is a movie club right here. You were talking about how he almost gets praised for it, right? And I do believe that's a take in the movie. This time around, I was wondering how much of that isn't in his head, considering that this movie's so ballsy in the way that it shows you a sequence as if it's real when really it's all in his mind. Right?
So that's one of the fascinating things, and another thing that it sort of does in the inverse of Joker, where Joker sort of takes like, oh, these elements are a fantasy as like a big reveal later in the film. As you mentioned, this movie starts with the beginning. No, he is like fantasizing a lot of these things, and it shows you these fantasies, so that when you get to that ending sequence, it kind of is left up to you to sort of decide like how much of this is his fantasy of how things went and how much of this is actually a reflection of what could have happened. And like I think what's interesting is that it's like maybe like plausibly enough in the middle. Like it's probably more fantasy. It's a little bit of like Taxi Driver ending-ish, if you want to say that. But I think it's also like it still is a bit of a commentary on these like things that dominate media cycles, right? These things that garner attention and notoriety, the sellability of notoriety, right? So even if it is a fantasy, I think it's a pretty interesting observation for Scorsese to be making, particularly at this moment where he feels like his fame has reached a new height.
Where do you fall?
I mean, for some people, he fell at King of Comedy. I don't think it.
No. I mean, where do you fall on the ending?
Oh, on the ending between the fantasy and reality?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it's probably fantasy, right? Like that feels too clean. But at the same way, I also would be open to it being a real what we're supposed to think is real life.
Yeah. I think the first time around when I saw it, I was like completely convinced. Yeah. I was taking it as like society's messed up. Of course they would, right? Of course they would see what he did and then still accept him up there. And I think that's still strong enough to hold. But this time around, I was really paying attention to the editing and just the way that he sets up things. And I think if you follow it through like what he's wearing and how he styles himself, there's a degree where you can look at it and be like, it's consistent to this being when he's in a fantasy scene with what he's wearing as opposed to when he's actually in reality with how he does, his own makeup and especially with what he's wearing. So, man, I do owe it that extra half star. When a movie can balance that perfectly, I think that's beautiful. I think a big part of it too, as I was reading more into it on this rewatch, was how much of it is improv. They were talking about being inspired by a lot of moments. Scorsese has this story about him having a stalker and him taking him out to eat, which I think is hilarious. Because only a crazy person who would do that would make a movie like this. But then the idea that there was so much improv to the point that the method acting was De Niro pissing off Jerry Lewis.
Jerry Lewis, yeah.
Yeah, to the point that he was like pushing his button. So a lot of the reactions are like
Genuine.
He's being freaked out because he wasn't expecting all that. And even the fact that Jerry Lewis kept his name so that they had that meta aspect that when they're walking through the streets, people would be saying Jerry.
Yep.
And they wouldn't be actors, they would be real people fawning over him. I think that works beautifully in the movie.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it is a really good performance from Jerry Lewis, even though I feel like he legendarily did not have a good time on that film.
It's been nothing but complaints after the fact, but but it works really well.
It's such a resonant movie in a lot of ways. To me, like especially the rewatch really helped unlock it more for me. Like I definitely have it among my favorite Scorsese movies ever.
It's really good.
It bumped it way up in the rankings for me. Were there any particular scenes or moments that really stood out to you, particularly on your rewatch of it?
Again, just a lot of the editing in terms of you know, he's fighting with people at the telephone booth, but in reality he's just like sleeping, right? He goes
Yeah.
to the diner, or he's at the bar, and the conversation with the bartender then becomes a dinner date. Like, just the smoothness of that is so scary and so effective in putting you into the way that this guy thinks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of that stood out for me this time.
Yeah. I just think the whole like ending few scenes, it's this really interesting high wire act, and I love the way that they sort of tease you with his monologue, and you kind of are left wondering like is this guy actually kind of funny? And like they
Right?
they sort of tell you exactly how funny he is. The producer, I think, gives him a very fair reading of his levels as a comedian.
Yeah.
But like when you actually get the monologue, it kind of feels like, oh, he's kind of pulling this off in
It's
a weird,
not
perverse
bad.
way. Yeah,
Right, because they film it in that late night type camera
Setting, yeah.
He's doing it all in one go. Like, it's actually pretty solid.
Yeah,
It
De
might
Niro did a
be
decent job.
a pretty underrated De Niro performance.
I think it's a really good performance, particularly because it is, seeing him in this kind of different mode. And yeah, he does have his moments where he gets to be a little bit like unhinged and terrifying. But those parts when he's trying to be affable and a comedian, he's got this like patheticness that is so like, I don't know. I think it's so well done, and he really fully embodies that character. It's a
Takes a
really
lot of
interesting, really interesting performance for sure.
But then again, the shots of New York are they're beautiful. There's that moment when he's in Times Square, and it just
Did
like
you
it feels
notice-
like a time capsule.
2 movie theaters directly in Times Square. They had a Regal and then another one with Blade Runner and The World According to Garp on the marquee. Want to go back to that time, man.
Yeah, it's like both the grungiest period that you don't want to be in, but you do want to walk down one street.
Yeah, a little bit
And
romantic.
Again, who better than Scorsese to have been the person to document that? So it's like they're almost, I'm not being pretentious to call them documentaries, but it's like they are periods of time that he's captured on film beautifully, especially with
Absolutely.
this next one.
Yeah, After Hours was his next feature film. After, as I mentioned, he was hoping to do The Last Temptation of Christ, but that would have to wait a couple more years. He ended up getting this script for After Hours and filming it very kind of run and gun. A lot of shots were kind of imagined on the day or on the at set, including the sequence when he has the keys thrown down at him, which I thought was really, really cool reading up about. I'm assuming you read some behind the scenes on that as well.
that they almost killed him and he didn't even realize that because they're just testing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You forget that all these shots that we take for granted now because it's CGI or drones, it's like, no, they were putting that massive camera into a box and then just dropping it and hoping that it didn't, like, unplunge itself. So it's really cool. It's so innovative.
Earlier this year when Ari Aster was beginning to show Beau Is Afraid, he had a long dialogue with Martin Scorsese where they previewed the film. And, obviously Marty's a master and everybody is going to be in awe of him for a number of reasons. But I did find it to be kind of an interesting pairing. I know Marty has talked about Ari's films, but, they don't necessarily always have a lot in common, at least from my perspective. But I hadn't seen After Hours, and comparing that directly with Beau Is Afraid.
Oh, is your first view too?
Yeah, this is my first view of After Hours as well. The lineage is clear as day. This is the One Crazy Night movie to rule all One Crazy Night movies. It's about a ordinary word processor who has the worst night of his life after agreeing to visit a girl that he met at a coffee shop earlier in the evening. It's a movie about this guy's New York experience spinning out of control as he goes from apartment to bar to subway to poisoned interaction after poisoned interaction, coming across a crazy cast of characters and a lot of really interesting actors in this one. Not necessarily like the biggest names. Catherine O'Hara, I thought was really incredible here. A lot of women in particular, a lot of the supporting women in this movie are so memorable. But yeah, this movie just has this like riotous energy and this unfolding sense of chaos. What did you think about After Hours?
Bro, this has been one that's been on my watch list for the longest time, and it delivered to an insane degree. You know, for the people who thought Beau Is Afraid was a little too much, this is that energy amped up to a degree where maybe the other one was a little too depressing and too many mommy issues. I think anyone can relate to a dude who's just, you know, trying to clock out of work, and all
Trying
he
to
wants
get
to do
home.
is he just wants to get home, right?
Yeah.
And that girl who you said who he meets, I heard someone say that this was originally titled like One Night in Soho or like a Last Night in Soho, which I thought was kind of interesting to what movie would end up taking that title.
Right.
But Marcy's played by Rosanna Arquette, and I'm like, why do you
Yeah.
look so familiar? Mama Arquette, bro. Like, she gave birth to 4 other actors, and obviously she's been in a slew of movies. But the idea of never being able to get back home is fantastic. I'm gonna say this right here, right? Because we're obviously in the book movie club of this. Oh, if you haven't seen this movie, go do yourself a favor and see it, because they had so many endings that they wanted to do for this movie. I heard they tested one out where we're in full spoiler. The highest recommendation from the both of us. Go watch it. It
Yeah.
delivered on my watch list.
Absolutely.
That they were going to keep him in the cast. And the test audience were like, no. And at first, I thought, like, all that matters in a movie is that you can make a person believe who's watching it. There's no way it's going to end that way.
Yeah.
The fact that it ends up being him just going back to work and he never went home is
Yeah.
an incredible ending, bro. That
Yeah.
is a
An incredible
timeless ending.
punchline to
I
this
hear
joke
that,
of a movie.
It was Shoemaker, the editor, which I'm going to say this right here. Probably one of the best edited Scorsese movies she's ever done.
Oh,
the
yeah.
editing in here, no, dude, the editing in here is insane. I was just
Yeah.
talking about how good it was for King of Comedy. This is like
Yeah.
twice that. This is some of the best editing he's ever done. You're telling me he was doing a lot of this on the fly? Well, bro, then he's got to do more stuff with an interim in between moment, because the way
Yeah.
he shot this has so much energy. It is cut
Yeah.
beautifully. They're just like, there's this shot of Marcy where just like dollies into her face. There's this one bit where like it was like a sliding shot that he had. That moment you were talking about when the camera comes down on him, incredible. I heard that it was Shoemaker's husband, who was a director at the time, who said,
Yes.
there's only one way for you to end this, Marty, and it's there. If it's not for that man, I don't know if this would have been considered as much of a cult classic if it's not for that ending of him just going straight back to work after that crazy night.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a like perfect button on this movie that just unfolds in a really crazy way. I saw somebody who said like it feels like a paranoid thriller, but he's not paranoid. There's actually people after him.
Yes.
Like it's just like so deranged, and it builds and builds and builds in a ridiculous way. It just like it's one of those films that you feel like it can't get crazier than that, and it finds a way to chop it in a way that still feels like it's
Without
in the
tipping?
same universe, right?
Yeah.
It never really tips over that line. It all, it just feels like I don't know how often that experience has happened to you, but like I feel like it's very familiar to like, oh, even though it's more modern, like sometimes my phone dies and I'm in a random street and it's like, all right, I got to just figure out how I'm getting back to where I came from.
You end up
But,
getting
like,
paper mache.
yeah, and you just never know like what surprises a city can have in store, or what interesting people lurk around different corners. I just think it's such a fun collection of characters that they've created and environments that they explore. Cheech and Chong show up towards the end. It's so
Great performances from them.
and it also just feels sort of like the air text of so many movies like this, where a night sort of just spills out and goes and loses control, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's just trying to get home. It was interesting to see that Tim Burton was supposed to direct this. And then, like you said, the moment it freed up for Scorsese, Tim Burton gave it to him. Because I could see Tim Burton handling a version of this. So to
Right.
see how Scorsese was able to approach it, like, it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
On top of that, this being the influence to After Hours by The Weeknd.
Right. Connecting a lot of dots for you.
Yeah, right. I was like, okay, like what? Because his whole rollout for that was influenced by this movie in terms of him just being out on a crazy night that gets even crazier and crazier. Obviously, for him, it tips way over, and he finds himself
Yeah.
at the Super Bowl in a House of Mirrors. But just to show you the influence that this still has all these years later, and a lot of parodies that that have come from it. I saw one tidbit that they mapped it out. If he would have just walked home, it would have been the length of the movie. That's funny.
Yeah.
That's great.
Do you think this is more of like a horror or a comedy?
Oh, it's a perfect blend of both. I like
Yeah.
you watch this movie and you understand why he loves Ari so much. Like
Right.
it's that perfect blend of the two where they're right next to each other. You know, they're almost the exact same emotion at the same time. It's horrific because of how funny it is, and it's so funny because of how horrific it is. It's it's fantastic.
I also got some vibes of another favorite of yours, Under the Silver Lake, just in the growing
okay.
chaos of it. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly like a whole laundry list of movies that have.
Yeah, there's a point where you think it's
taken
gonna become
influence
Pee
from
Wee's
this.
Playhouse, bro. And it just stops itself from going
Yeah.
there.
Something that we didn't mention yet are the Martin Scorsese cameos. He has a couple fun,
does.
like blink and you'll miss him cameos in either of these films. Did you prefer one or the other over the other?
In the first one, he's like the film producer, right? And he just like
Or
walks away.
He's the late night TV show director.
Yeah, and then here he is.
He's like controlling the lights at the Mohawk Punk Club. Sort of like does a pan up to the guy moving the spotlight around.
I'm gonna go with the King of Comedy one because it's funny that
Yeah.
he's the shortest one in the room. He just
he's
walks
also-
away.
He's also got a line in King of Comedy as opposed to
Yeah,
this one.
I'm
but
gonna go with that one.
it's another fun game to play going through Scorsese's filmography is spot the cameo.
That he's always in it. Yeah.
Yeah. So comparing these two movies, is there one that you prefer? Is it hard to distinguish? Like, is it the one has a vibe you like more or a story that just resonates better?
It's not fair because I've seen one twice.
Twice.
Over the fresh one that I have for
It's
After
a good
Hours.
point, and I'm in the same boat as you.
You know, and I know it's a cop out to say like, yo, I'm equally like I gave them both 4 stars with the heart. I would not mind on another watch giving it another half star. If anything, I should have given it already. As of right now, I can't wait to watch After Hours again.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am really hungry to watch After Hours again because, like you, is my first time. I'm with you in that 4-star. I bumped King of Comedy up to a 5 for me. I think that is a really fascinating, beautifully done movie. So
Yeah, I might have to give it the half star.
funny.
All right, if you're listening to this and you're a
It's
letterbox
new-
cop, this is exactly what I'm this is exactly what I'm bumping up that half
Hell
star
yeah.
for King of
I
Comedy.
love it. I love it.
Oh, did I feel like I need to give it to
We just got to go through all the Scorsese movies.
we're just
again.
gonna have to go through it all,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh man, no. After Hours has this one shot where he's running through New York, and it's just the street signs.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so good.
Oh my god. Yeah, there's just so much style. And when you talk about how people have while a lot of people I feel like have aped sort of the vibe and the themes of King of Comedy, when people talk about borrowing for Scorsese stylistically, it's a lot of the stuff in After Hours and how they shoot
yeah,
it, how
the blueprint.
how dynamic the camera is in that movie. Both just incredibly influential movies. Hopefully, all of y'all had a chance to catch up with us because it was a lot of fun to both rewatch King of Comedy and catch After Hours for a first time for
sir.
me. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I think that's about it for this edition of Scorsese-tober. We're back again next week to talk about Scorsese and religion through a pair of films, The Last Temptation of Christ and Silence, both of which will be new to me. So I'm very excited to do those rewatches, or watches, I should say. Art, where can people find more from you?
You can find me over at LME Movies on Twitter, on YouTube, on Letterboxd, where I'm trying to log more stuff daily, or every week here on the Intercut podcast.
Yeah, you can find more from me as well at Zshevich across social media or on my YouTube and TikTok channels at Multiplex Show. But I am also here every Monday streaming Weekend Must Watch on Intercut. You can listen to the audio version of the podcast on iTunes, Anchor, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcatcher is. I love Overcast. And then make sure you subscribe not just to the audio podcast, but to the video feed as well on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/IntercutPod, where you can watch our tired smiling faces as we
Our
break
after
down the
hours
latest
faces.
and yeah, Intercut After Dark Hours for sure. Find new episodes of Weekend Must Watch streaming every Monday. We're doing the Scorsese-tober episodes every Thursday, but you can catch them early as early as Tuesday by donating as little as $1 a month over on patreon.com/intercutpod, where you get all sorts of updates from us throughout the week. Follow us on social media, also at IntercutPod, to get updates from Art, from me, from all the guests that we feature here on Intercut. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.